For 35 years, my brother drove 140 miles every second Thursday. I always thought it was for a quiet fishing trip. But when he passed away, I opened a hidden steel box in his closet, and my entire world collapsed. I realized I was the actual target of a decades-long conspiracy, and he had been my only shield. Before I tell you the rest of my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a family secret that changed everything. My name is Warren. I am 66 years old, and up until 3 days ago, I thought I had a normal, somewhat flawed, but decent family. I built a commercial real estate firm from the ground up, providing a life of extreme comfort for my wife Cynthia and my son Nolan. But comfort breeds entitlement, and entitlement breeds monsters. The rain came down in cold, gray sheets at the cemetery, drumming a hollow rhythm against the cheap pine casket. My older brother Russell was being lowered into the ground. He was 68. A quiet man, a mechanic who lived in a cramped, drafty apartment on the wrong side of town. He never asked me for a single dime of my fortune. He was the only person in the world who loved me for who I was, not for what my bank accounts could provide. I stood there, letting the rain soak through my dark suit, my chest tight with a grief so heavy it made it hard to breathe. Standing 2 steps behind me under a massive golf umbrella were Cynthia and Nolan. They were not mourning. They were complaining. "Are we almost done here?" Nolan muttered, aggressively tapping the screen of his smartwatch. "The mud is ruining my Italian loafers. I have an investor call in an hour." Cynthia pulled her cashmere coat tighter around her shoulders, shivering with exaggerated disgust. "He lived like a pauper, and he is being buried like one," she whispered, though loud enough for me to hear. What an absolute wasted afternoon. I did not turn around. I did not scream at them. Decades of marriage to Cynthia had taught me that reacting to her venom only gave her power. I simply stood there, gripping the wet grass in my mind, mourning the only man who truly had my back. Russell had always looked at Cynthia with a quiet, guarded distrust. He never came to our sprawling suburban home for holidays. He always insisted we meet at a local diner for coffee. I used to think he was just stubborn, maybe intimidated by the wealth. I had no idea he was sitting across from me bearing the weight of a secret that would have driven me to the edge of insanity. The morning after the funeral, I drove my old Chevy truck to Russell's apartment to clear out his belongings. Cynthia had flat out refused to help, stating she could not stand the smell of cheap linoleum and failure. Nolan had ignored my text messages entirely. I was alone, which was exactly how I needed to be. The apartment was tiny, smelling of old coffee grounds, motor oil, and aged paper. I spent hours bagging up his flannel shirts, his worn-out boots, and his collection of vintage car magazines. It broke my heart to see how little he possessed. When I reached the bedroom closet, I began packing away an old stack of shoeboxes. As I shifted my weight, a floorboard groaned underneath my boot. It was loose. I knelt down, wedging my fingers into the crack, and pried the warped piece of wood upward. Beneath it, resting in the dusty, dark cavity between the joists, was a heavy, rusted steel box. It was secured with a thick brass padlock. Russell was a simple man who kept his cash in a coffee can on the kitchen counter. He had no reason to hide a locked steel vault under his floor. My pulse quickened. I walked out to my truck, grabbed a heavy iron hammer from my toolbox, and returned to the bedroom. It took 3 solid, bone-rattling strikes to shatter the old padlock. I threw the lid back. The hinges shrieked in protest. Inside the box was meticulously organized. The first thing I pulled out was a thick, rubber-banded stack of faded gas station receipts. They spanned exactly 35 years. I looked at the addresses printed on the faded thermal paper. Every single receipt was from a coastal town exactly 140 miles away. Every single one was dated on a Thursday. Beneath the receipts lay a collection of photograph albums. I opened the first one and my breath caught in my throat. It was a little girl. First with blonde pigtails walking in a park, then in a school uniform holding a spelling bee certificate, then a teenager at graduation. Finally, a beautiful woman in her 30s. She had my jawline. She had my exact green eyes. And she had Russell's warm, crooked smile. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I tossed the albums aside and dug deeper into the bottom of the steel box. There, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, was a birth certificate from 1991. The father's name was listed as Warren. The mother's name was Cynthia. Beneath the birth certificate was a yellowed, legally notarized document, an infant surrender form. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Cynthia's sharp, elegant, unmistakable cursive. In 1991, I was working back-to-back offshore drilling contracts, breaking my back overseas for 9 months to secure the seed money for my first real estate venture. Cynthia had called me in tears while I was stationed on a rig in the North Sea. She told me she had gone into premature labor. She told me our baby girl had died due to severe lung complications. I spent an entire month's salary to fly home just to stand in front of an empty memorial plaque, holding my sobbing wife, blaming myself for not being there. The truth laid out in front of me was a living nightmare. The baby had not died. She had survived, but she had been born with respiratory issues that required expensive round-the-clock care. Cynthia, obsessed with her social calendar and terrified of being burdened by a sick, high-maintenance infant while I was away, had simply surrendered her to the state. She threw our child away like a piece of defective luggage. Russell must have found out. My quiet, broke mechanic brother must have discovered what my wife had done. Instead of letting my daughter vanish into the foster system, and instead of destroying me with the truth while I was thousands of miles away trying to build a future, Russell stepped in. He had taken custody. He had moved her 140 miles away to keep her hidden from the woman who threw her away. He had driven those 140 miles every second Thursday to pay for her medical bills, to attend her parent-teacher conferences, to be the father I was robbed of being. He lived in poverty because he was secretly funding my daughter's life. I dropped the papers on the floor, falling back against the closet door, as the walls of the apartment seemed to close in on me. The woman I shared a bed with for 4 decades was a sociopath. The son she had raised, Nolan, was a carbon copy of her greed. I was surrounded by predators. And Russell, the man they mocked at his own funeral, had died protecting me. I carefully folded the surrender form and the photographs, sliding them into my jacket pocket. A cold, hard realization settled in my chest, freezing my grief and replacing it with pure, calculated rage. They thought I was just a grieving, broken old man. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their perfect, privileged world to the ground. The drive back to the affluent suburbs felt like navigating through a thick, disorienting fog. My knuckles were white against the worn leather steering wheel of my truck. In my chest pocket, the infant surrender form felt heavier than a block of lead burning a hole through my shirt. I did not speed. I did not scream. The shock had bypassed anger, entirely settling into a cold, clinical, absolute clarity. Every memory of my 40-year marriage was currently rewinding and playing back through a new, horrifying lens. The times Cynthia claimed she needed a weekend spa retreat to recover from the trauma of our lost child. The times she insisted we buy Nolan another luxury vehicle to ensure he felt fully supported. It was all a meticulously choreographed performance. I turned onto my street lined with manicured oak trees and sprawling estates. My house, an imposing colonial structure with pristine white pillars, mocked me. I had paid for every brick, every blade of grass, every drop of water in the heated pool. I had built a fortress for a family of parasites. I parked the truck halfway down the driveway, cutting the engine early so it would coast to a silent stop. I walked up the stone pathway, the rain having finally stopped, leaving the afternoon air heavy and damp. I turned my key in the front door, with the practiced slowness of a man who suddenly realizes he is stepping into a den of vipers. The heavy mahogany door swung open without a sound. The marble foyer was immaculate, smelling of expensive vanilla diffusers and fresh lilies. From the sprawling gourmet kitchen down the hall, the clinking of fine porcelain and the low hum of voices drifted toward me. I did not announce my return. I slipped off my Vanot boots, leaving them on the mat, and walked in my socks down the corridor. pressing my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, just out of sight of the kitchen island. I held my breath. It was Valerie, my daughter-in-law, speaking first. Her voice carried that familiar nasal whine she always used when a barista got her complicated coffee order wrong. She said she could not believe that pathetic old grease monkey left everything to a stray dog charity, the sharp clack of her manicured nails tapping against the granite countertop echoing in the large room. She complained that Nolan spent an hour on the phone with the county clerk trying to contest it, but the mechanic actually had a registered will. $15,000, Cynthia, she scoffed. He had $15,000 sitting in a local credit union, and he gave it to an animal shelter instead of his own nephew. It is a direct insult. I stood frozen in the shadows. Russell had lived on canned soup and instant coffee his entire life, but he had managed to save a modest sum. The fact that my wealthy son and his wife, dripping in designer clothing and driving imported cars, were genuinely enraged over missing out on $15,000 from a dead man they despised made my stomach churn with pure disgust. Then my son spoke. Nolan sounded frantic, his voice lacking its usual arrogant drawl. He told Valerie to forget Uncle Russell and his pocket change. The startup is bleeding capital, he snapped. The bridge loan is due on the 1st of the month, and the investors are threatening to pull out entirely. He admitted that if he did not inject $200,000 by next Friday, they were going to force him into bankruptcy. I heard the scraping of a bar stool as Nolan apparently stood up, pacing the kitchen tiles. "Mom, you need to handle Dad right now," he urged. "You saw him at the cemetery. He is completely shattered. This grief-induced fragility is our window. You have to get him to sign the medical power of attorney while he is barely functioning." I waited for my wife to defend me. I waited for the woman I had slept next to for 4 decades to tell our son to back off, to say that I needed time to mourn my only brother. Instead, I heard the soft, elegant sipping of her tea, followed by a dry, calculating sigh. She told Nolan she had already called the notary, her tone as casual as if she were discussing dinner plans. "I will tell him it is a standard estate update to ensure we are protected if he has a heart attack from the stress," she explained. "He trusts me blindly. He always has. Once my signature holds legal authority over his assets, we will liquidate the primary retirement portfolio." She pointed out that I had $2.5 million sitting in low-yield mutual funds just gathering dust. She promised Nolan they could funnel what he needed into his tech company through a dummy consulting contract. Valerie chimed back, in her mood instantly lifting. She breathed a sigh of relief, stating that the lease on her luxury sport utility vehicle was up for renewal, and the country club expected their annual membership dues by Tuesday. She firmly declared she was not downgrading her lifestyle just because her father-in-law wanted to sit around staring at the wall crying over a mechanic. Cynthia chuckled, a soft, chilling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She assured Valerie that nobody was downgrading. "Warren will sit in his recliner grieving for months," Cynthia promised. "By the time he actually looks at a bank statement, the money will be thoroughly diversified into our accounts." She added they would simply tell me the market took a downturn, brushing me off as too old and tired to understand complex tech investments anyway. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the back of my head against the wall. The sheer magnitude of their predatory greed was paralyzing. My entire 40-year marriage was a commercial transaction. My relationship with my son was an illusion maintained solely by my financial utility. They did not see me as a husband or a father. To them, I was merely a walking bank vault, an expiring resource to be harvested and discarded. They were actively plotting to strip me of my life savings to fund their vanity and their failures, all while assuming I was too weak and stupid to stop them. I thought about the countless hours I had spent reviewing contracts, negotiating leases, and building my real estate firm from nothing. I had fought ruthless competitors and navigated vicious market crashes. I had done it all to ensure my family never had to experience the poverty I grew up with. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to give them the world, and they repaid me by sharpening their knives the moment my back was turned. They had mistaken my quiet devotion for blind stupidity. They mistook my grief for terminal weakness. A weaker man might have stepped into the kitchen right then. A weaker man might have screamed, thrown plates, and demanded answers. But confronting them now would only give them the opportunity to destroy evidence, hide their financial liabilities, and mount a legal defense. If I walked into that kitchen, I would be playing by their rules. I opened my eyes. The blinding grief I had felt at the cemetery was entirely gone, eradicated by a searing white-hot clarity. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded infant surrender form, ensuring it was still there. My daughter was out there in a coastal town 140 miles away, living a life she built without a single dime of my corrupted money. She was the only real family I had left in this world. I moved backward down the hallway, stepping silently in my socks. I reached the foyer, grabbed my wet boots, and slipped out the front door, closing it with a soft, imperceptible click. The afternoon sun was just beginning to break through the gray clouds, casting a sharp light across the manicured lawn. I walked down the driveway to my truck, tossing my boots into the passenger seat and starting the engine. They thought I was a fragile, grieving old man ready to hand over my empire. They thought they were the predators in this house. As I pulled out of the neighborhood, leaving my sprawling fake home behind, I made a silent vow to my late brother. Russell had sacrificed his entire life, his own potential for a family, to shield my daughter from this nest of vipers. He had carried the burden of Cynthia's monstrous secret so I could live in peace. He had driven those miles in silence, ensuring my bloodline survived away from this toxicity. I owed it to his memory to finish what he started. I would not shed another tear. I would strip them of everything they valued. I would systematically dismantle their privileged reality piece by piece. I would let them walk blindly into their own trap. And when the time came, I would lock the doors behind them. The morning sun pierced through the heavy silk drapes of our master bedroom, casting a bright, invasive glow across the expensive hardwood floor. I kept my eyes tightly shut. I pressed the heels of my hands against my temples and let out a low, labored groan. Cynthia was standing near the vanity mirror, clasping a string of pearls around her neck. She was humming a soft, cheerful tune, completely unbothered by the fact that we had just buried my only brother yesterday. She did not ask if I was all right. She simply sighed a sharp sound of profound irritation and muttered that my grief was becoming highly inconvenient for her social schedule. I told her the migraine was blinding. I told her I could not possibly look at any legal documents or listen to Nolan pitch his startup today. I asked her to close the door and let me sleep in absolute darkness. She obliged without a single word of sympathy. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I listened to the sharp, rhythmic tapping of her designer heels fading down the long corridor. I waited in the silent bedroom. I listened to the muffled voices downstairs in the kitchen. I heard the heavy garage door open and the aggressive roar of Nolan imported sports car pulling out into the street. 10 minutes later, I heard Cynthia leave for her weekly country club brunch. The sprawling, empty house settled into a suffocating quiet. I threw off the heavy duvet. I was not sick. My mind had never been sharper. I dressed quickly in an old pair of denim jeans and a faded canvas jacket, leaving my tailored suits behind. I bypassed the security system, slipped out the side door, and climbed into my rusted truck. I placed the stack of faded gas station receipts on the passenger seat next to me. They were my map. They were the breadcrumbs my brother had left behind for me to follow. I turned the ignition key and pulled out of the wealthy, manicured neighborhood. I pointed the truck toward the highway. I was going to make the exact drive my brother Russell had made every second Thursday for 35 years. 140 miles. The city skyline gradually gave way to sprawling highways and dense pine forests. The rhythm of the tires humming against the asphalt became a hypnotic soundtrack to my thoughts. I drove in total silence. I thought about Russell making this exact trek in the dead of winter, through torrential rain and under the blazing summer sun. He had done it in a beat-up sedan with a failing transmission and no air conditioning. He had done it while working 60 hours a week as a mechanic just to scrape together enough money to pay for a child that belonged to me. He endured poverty and loneliness so that my daughter would never feel abandoned by the world. Every mile marker I passed felt like a heavy physical weight pressing down on my chest. I felt a profound, crushing guilt for the comfortable, luxurious life I had lived while my brother carried the ultimate burden. I remembered how he always smelled of motor oil and peppermint, and how he never once complained about being tired. He smiled through his exhaustion because he had a purpose I knew nothing about. As the miles ticked away, the dense forests slowly thinned out, replaced by the flat, sandy expanses of the coastline. The air coming through the cracked window turned crisp and salty. The scent of the ocean hit me sharp and clean. It was a completely different world from the suffocating, artificial luxury of my suburban estate. This was a place where people worked with their hands, where the salt wore away the paint on the houses, and where life was simple and honest. This was the world Russell had chosen to raise her in, far away from Cynthia and her toxic ambition. I reached the small coastal town just before noon. Following the addresses printed on the old envelopes and receipts, I navigated the narrow streets lined with seafood diners and small local businesses. I pulled into a parking space across the street from a renovated brick building. A sleek, modern sign hung above the double glass doors. It read, "Coastal Horizon Architecture." I turned off the truck engine. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I could barely breathe. I stared through the large glass storefront. Inside the office was bright and bustling. Drafting tables were scattered across an open floor plan, bathed in natural light. And then I saw her. She was standing near the center of the room, leaning over a massive blueprint. She was 35 years old. She wore a simple white blouse and dark trousers, her hair tied back in a practical, messy knot. She was pointing at a design flaw, directing a small team of younger architects who listened to her with obvious respect and admiration. She gestured with her hands when she spoke, a sharp, decisive movement that I recognized instantly. It was the exact same way I moved my hands when negotiating a commercial real estate deal. I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned closer to the truck window. She turned her head, laughing at something a colleague said. The world outside my truck completely vanished. All the ambient noise of the coastal street, the seagulls, the passing cars, faded into absolute silence. She had my eyes, the exact same piercing, deep green eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. But when she smiled, it was purely Russell. It was that warm, slightly crooked, genuine smile that could instantly disarm anyone in the room. A single tear slipped down my weathered cheek, tracing a hot path to my jaw. She was beautiful. She was brilliant. She was alive. My daughter, the infant I had mourned for decades in an empty cemetery, was standing right across the street. She was a living, breathing testament to my brother's ultimate sacrifice. Russell had not just kept her alive. He had raised a leader, a professional, a woman of substance and character. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to open the truck door. I desperately wanted to run across that street, push open those glass doors, and wrap my arms around her. I wanted to drop to my knees and beg for her forgiveness. I wanted to tell her who I was, that I never abandoned her, and that I had loved her every single day of my life without even knowing she existed. My hand reached for the door handle. I wanted to feel like a father again. But then a dark, paralyzing realization washed over me. I froze. If I walked through those doors right now, I would not just be bringing a father into her life. I would be bringing Cynthia. My legal and financial existence was currently completely intertwined with a woman who had thrown this child away like defective garbage. Cynthia and Nolan were actively plotting to seize control of my entire estate. If Cynthia discovered that Natalie was alive, she would instantly recognize the catastrophic threat to her wealth. Cynthia possessed the financial resources and the ruthless malice to destroy Natalie's life. She would hire vicious lawyers to tie my daughter up in endless litigation. She would drag Natalie's name through the mud, slander her professional reputation, and use her as emotional leverage to force me into submission. She might even try to claim the architectural firm Natalie had worked so hard to build. I would be placing a massive, lethal target directly on the back of the child my brother had sacrificed his entire life to protect. I slowly pulled my hand away from the door handle. I forced myself to sit back in the worn driver's seat. The agony of being 50 feet away from my only child and not being able to speak to her was a physical torture. It tore at my insides, making my chest ache with a hollow pain. But I knew what had to be done. I could not be a father today. Today I had to be a soldier. I needed to secure my empire. I needed to build an impenetrable fortress around my wealth and legally sever every single tie to the parasites living in my home. I needed to ensure that when I finally stood in front of Natalie, I brought her absolute security, not a chaotic war zone. I watched her point to the blueprint one last time, her smile radiating through the glass. I burned that image into my mind. It was the fuel I needed for the upcoming slaughter. I started the truck engine. I put the vehicle in gear and slowly pulled away from the curb, forcing myself not to look back. I had a long drive ahead of me. I had a fortress to dismantle, and I had a war to win. The drive back from the coastal town felt entirely different from the journey there. The crushing weight of the past 35 years had been replaced by a sharp, burning focus. I navigated the highway back to my sprawling suburban estate, keeping my speed exactly at the limit. My mind was constructing a fortress. Every gear in my head turned with the precision of a seasoned real estate developer preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. I pulled my truck into the driveway and immediately noticed something out of place. A sleek, silver luxury sedan was parked near the front door. It did not belong to Cynthia, and it did not belong to my son. I gripped the steering wheel, letting the engine idle for a moment. My instincts, honed over decades of negotiating ruthless commercial deals, screamed at me. A predator was inside my home. I turned the key, placed my hand over my chest pocket, where my phone rested, and stepped out into the humid late afternoon air. I opened the front door with deliberate slowness. The house was quiet, but it was not the empty silence I had left behind that morning. It was a heavy, expectant quiet. I shuffled my feet slightly, scuffing the soles of my boots against the polished marble floor of the foyer. I needed to project weakness. I walked into the main living room and found Cynthia sitting on the velvet sofa. Her legs were crossed elegantly, and she was holding a delicate porcelain teacup. Sitting opposite her in my favorite leather armchair was a man I had never seen before. He was perhaps in his early 50s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked far too expensive for a casual afternoon visit. He had a smooth, polished appearance with slicked back hair and a predatory stillness about him. When I entered the room, Cynthia immediately placed her teacup on the glass table and manufactured a look of deep, profound sorrow. She rushed to my side, grabbing my arm with a grip that dug painfully into my skin. She guided me toward the sofa, speaking in a loud, patronizing tone as if I were a lost child. She cooed my name, telling me she was so worried because I had wandered off for hours. She said she brought someone to help us and introduced the stranger as Dr. Aris. She claimed he was a grief counselor specializing in traumatic loss. I looked at the man in the charcoal suit. Dr. Aris offered a warm, practiced smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. A grief counselor. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. In the affluent circles my wife maneuvered through, nobody called a grief counselor to the house unless they were managing a public relations crisis. This man was a hired gun. This was the medical ambush Nolan and Cynthia had been whispering about in the kitchen the day before. They were trying to establish a baseline of mental incompetence. I let my shoulders slump, allowing my posture to collapse into a shape of profound defeat. I nodded slowly, staring blankly at the expensive Persian rug beneath my feet. Before I sat down, I reached into my jacket, claiming I needed a handkerchief to wipe my brow. With a practiced, subtle motion, my thumb brushed the screen of my smartphone resting in my breast pocket. I blindly tapped the exact location of the voice recorder application. A tiny vibration confirmed the device was actively capturing every sound in the room. I sank heavily into the velvet cushions beside Cynthia, exhaling a long, trembling breath. Dr. Aris leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He spoke in a slow, syrupy cadence. He told me he understood I recently lost my brother, and noted that grief can do strange things to the mind. He suggested it can make us forgetful, disoriented, or confused about our surroundings. He then asked me to tell him where I went today. I let my eyes wander around the room, blinking slowly. I hesitated, buying time to craft the perfect response. I mumbled that I went for a drive. I let my voice crack slightly, adding that I just drove around. I lied and said I thought I saw Russell at the old hardware store, but the store was closed. I rubbed my forehead, projecting deep confusion, and muttered that it had been closed for years. Cynthia patted my knee dramatically, looking at the doctor with wide, tragic eyes. Dr. Aris nodded, writing something down in a small leather notebook. He asked me what day of the week it was. He asked me what year it was. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. These were not the questions of a grief counselor attempting to soothe a broken heart. These were the standard cognitive assessment tests designed to evaluate advanced dementia. I leaned completely into the skid. When he asked for the date, I gave him a day from 2 weeks ago. When he asked me to count backward, I stumbled on the third number, losing my place and shaking my head in frustration. I stared at my hands, rubbing them together as if trying to warm them. I told the doctor that I could not remember where I placed my keys this morning. I told him the house felt strange and that the walls seemed to be moving. I fed them exactly the narrative they desperately wanted to hear. I gave them the portrait of a senile, broken old man whose mind was rapidly deteriorating under the crushing weight of sudden tragedy. Dr. Aris kept his tone gentle, but his questions became more probing. He asked about my business. He asked if I was struggling to remember my financial passwords or if I found managing my estate overwhelming. I replied that numbers were starting to blur together on the page. I confessed that I had not looked at my bank accounts in weeks because the paperwork made me dizzy. I saw the corner of Cynthia's mouth twitch upward in a micro-expression of absolute triumph. They were swallowing the performance entirely. After 45 minutes of this degrading performance, Dr. Aris closed his leather notebook with a soft thud. He offered me a sympathetic nod. He softly stated that I was carrying a tremendous burden and suggested it was best if I rest now. He advised me to let my family take care of the heavy lifting. I nodded obediently, closing my eyes and leaning my head back against the sofa. I slowed my breathing, keeping it deep and rhythmic, simulating a sudden, exhausted sleep. I felt Cynthia stand up. She whispered to the doctor, thanking him for coming on such short notice. They walked together toward the foyer, their footsteps echoing lightly on the marble. I kept my eyes closed, but my hearing was sharply tuned to their fading conversation. The heavy front door opened and then closed with a solid click. A moment later, I heard the distinct sound of Nolan imported sports car pulling into the driveway. The front door opened again, and rapid footsteps entered the foyer. Nolan spoke in a hushed voice that buzzed with aggressive energy. He demanded to know if the plan worked. Cynthia let out a sharp, victorious laugh. She replied that it worked perfectly, her voice dripping with sheer predatory delight. She assured her son that the doctor was worth every single penny. She called me a complete mess and gloated that I could barely remember what month it was. She bragged that I admitted to the doctor my inability to comprehend my own financial documents anymore. Nolan let out a heavy sigh of relief. He immediately asked about the paperwork. Cynthia told him that Dr. Aris was drafting the preliminary evaluation of severe cognitive decline tonight. She said the medical incompetence paperwork would be officially signed and notarized by Friday morning. She declared that once the judge signs off on Friday afternoon, they will have absolute legal power of attorney. She laid out the rest of the plan, stating they would freeze my assets, shift the commercial real estate deeds, and funnel the $2.5 million into his startup before the weekend was over. She laughed again, declaring that I would be legally powerless. I remained perfectly still on the velvet sofa. The voice recorder in my pocket captured every single syllable of their treason. Friday. Today was Tuesday. I did the math instantly in my head. I had less than 72 hours before my own wife and son completely and legally paralyzed me. I had 3 days before every bank account, every property, and every asset I had spent my entire life building would be locked behind a court order controlled by my enemies. If they succeeded, I would be trapped in my own home, stripped of my wealth, and unable to protect the daughter I had just found. The window of opportunity was vanishing rapidly. They believed they had outsmarted a dying old man. They believed their carefully constructed medical fraud would proceed without a single obstacle. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. I was not a victim waiting for the slaughter. I was a veteran of brutal commercial warfare, and they had just handed me their entire battle plan. I waited until I heard Cynthia and Nolan walk toward the kitchen to celebrate their impending victory. I slowly opened my eyes. The living room was quiet. I reached into my pocket, stopped the recording, and saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. The clock was ticking loudly in my ears. I had exactly 3 days to burn their world to ash. Wednesday morning broke with a heavy, oppressive humidity. I put on my worn canvas jacket and grabbed an old wooden walking cane I had not used since a knee surgery a decade ago. I shuffled into the kitchen where Cynthia was sipping her morning espresso. I let my hands tremble slightly as I poured a glass of water. I told her I was going to the neighborhood park to feed the ducks and clear my head. She did not even look up from her tablet. She simply waved her hand and told me not to get lost. She reminded me that the notary was coming on Friday and I needed to rest my brain. I nodded weakly and dragged my feet across the marble foyer, playing the role of the broken man to absolute perfection. I shuffled down the driveway and out of the affluent suburban bubble. I kept the slow, unsteady pace for exactly 3 blocks until I was entirely out of sight from the house windows. Then I straightened my spine. I lifted the cane off the pavement and walked with the brisk, aggressive stride of a man preparing for war. I bypassed the local park entirely and hailed a city cab, paying the driver in cash to take me straight to the downtown financial district. The glass and steel skyscraper loomed over the busy streets. I rode the elevator to the 50th floor, stepping into the sleek, minimalist lobby of the city's most ruthless corporate litigation firm. I did not have an appointment, but when I gave the receptionist my name, she immediately ushered me into the corner office. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Attorney Bennett. We had crossed paths many times during my commercial real estate career. He was a legal shark, a man who dismantled fraudulent corporations and shredded hostile takeovers for sport. He did not offer empty condolences about my brother. He simply asked what kind of battle we were fighting today. I sat down and placed my smartphone on the polished wood. I played the audio file I had recorded the day before. The pristine acoustics of the office amplified Dr. Aris delivering his fake cognitive assessment. The recording continued playing Cynthia and Nolan's vile celebration in the kitchen. Their entire conspiracy to declare me legally incompetent by Friday afternoon echoed off the glass walls. Bennett listened with absolute stillness. His eyes, cold and calculating, registered every single legal violation committed in that recording. When the audio finished, I reached into my jacket. I pulled out the yellowed 1991 infant surrender form and slid it across the desk. I told him my wife had thrown our child away 35 years ago, and my brother had sacrificed his life to raise her in secret. I told Bennett that my family was a cartel of parasites preparing to drain my estate, and I needed to annihilate them. Bennett picked up the infant surrender form, his jaw tightening, as he read Cynthia's signature. He set the paper down and pressed a button on his intercom, instructing his paralegal to hold all his calls for the remainder of the day. He looked at me and said we were initiating the ghost protocols immediately. It was a strategy we had used years ago to shield vulnerable assets from aggressive, hostile takeovers. Bennett explained that by the time Cynthia brought her corrupt notary to my house on Friday, my financial footprint would cease to exist. He pulled up my portfolio on his dual monitors. With my explicit verbal and written authorization, Bennett began liquidating the low-yield mutual funds, tearing down the joint accounts, and severing Cynthia access to my primary capital. He drafted the emergency paperwork to transfer the entire $2.5 million retirement portfolio into an irrevocable blind trust. I named my newly discovered daughter Natalie as the sole ultimate beneficiary, though I kept her identity shielded behind layers of corporate anonymity. Within 2 hours, Bennett had systematically erased 40 years of visible wealth. If Cynthia tried to access the bank, she would find nothing but empty closed accounts. If Nolan attempted to leverage the estate, he would hit a solid legal brick wall. On paper, I was now a ghost. I owned absolutely nothing they could steal. I sat back in the leather chair, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over me. The fortress was secure. But Bennett was not finished. He was a man who believed in destroying the enemy offense before they could even draw their weapons. He summoned his lead forensic accountant into the office and handed him Nolan's name and business tax identification number. Bennett ordered a deep dive into my son's tech startup, demanding to know exactly why Nolan was so desperate to seize $200,000 by the end of the month. I drank a glass of water while the accountant worked silently in the adjacent room. I assumed Nolan was just a failed businessman trying to save his bruised ego. I assumed he wanted to keep playing the role of a successful tech entrepreneur for his arrogant wife, Valerie. I was entirely wrong. 30 minutes later, the accountant returned holding a red folder. He looked extremely grim. Bennett read the single-page report, and his cold demeanor fractured into genuine alarm. He looked at me and stated that the failing tech startup was merely a front. The bridge loan Nolan had been crying about in the kitchen did not exist. Nolan was not trying to save a legitimate business. My son had developed a catastrophic gambling addiction. The accountant had traced a series of massive hidden wire transfers connecting Nolan to an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate. Nolan had borrowed heavily from extremely dangerous people who operated far outside the boundaries of the law. The $200,000 he mentioned to Cynthia was just the overdue interest. The total principal debt was over $400,000. Bennett leaned across the mahogany desk, his voice dropping to a serious, urgent register. He warned me that these syndicate operators do not send collection letters or file lawsuits. When they are ignored, they send men to collect their pound of flesh. Nolan had explicitly promised these violent criminals that a massive inheritance payout was coming by the end of the week. My son had used my life savings as collateral to buy himself a few extra days of breathing room. If Nolan did not deliver that money, the syndicate would not just break his legs. They would come directly to the sprawling suburban estate where he lived. They would come to the house where I slept. The air in the corner office grew incredibly thin. The situation had just escalated from a white-collar financial crime to a matter of imminent physical survival. Nolan was not just a greedy, entitled child. He was a desperate, cornered animal willing to sacrifice my life and safety to save his own skin. He had invited absolute ruin to my front door. Bennett asked if I wanted to hire private armed security to extract me from the house immediately. I looked out the skyscraper window at the city below. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the fear quickly hardened into a cold, titanium resolve. I told Bennett that running away would only let them control the narrative. If I fled, Cynthia would use my disappearance to finalize the incompetence ruling, claiming I had wandered off in a state of advanced dementia. I had to go back into the den of vipers. I had to let them spring their trap so I could shut the iron jaws right back on them. I stood up, gripping my wooden cane. I told my lawyer to prepare the final counterstrike. I was going back home to face the monsters I had unwittingly created. I returned to the sprawling suburban house just before the afternoon storms rolled in. I kept my gait slow and labored as I walked through the front door, but Cynthia was waiting for me in the foyer. Her eyes narrowed as she inspected my wet canvas jacket and the mud on my boots. She asked me exactly how long I had been walking around the neighborhood park. She noted that I had been gone for hours. I mumbled a vague excuse about losing track of time while watching the ducks on the pond. I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. She did not like unpredictability. She needed me docile, predictable, and entirely under her control until the final court-mandated psychiatric evaluation took place on Friday. If I wandered off or showed flashes of independence, a court-appointed doctor might delay the guardianship proceedings. Cynthia realized she needed to tighten my leash. She told me the stress of my brother's death was putting too much strain on my fragile heart. She announced that she would be managing my evening routine to ensure I received adequate rest before the judge finalized our paperwork. That night, the new routine began. I was sitting in the leather armchair in my study, staring blindly at a muted television screen. The house was quiet, except for the heavy rain beating against the large glass windows. Cynthia walked into the room carrying a silver tray. Resting on the tray was a delicate porcelain teacup, matching the expensive china set we had received for our 20th anniversary. Steam curled from the surface, carrying the heavy, overwhelming scent of chamomile and an excessive amount of honey. She set the tray down on the small wooden table beside my chair. She smiled a tight, rehearsed expression of spousal concern. She told me she brewed a special tea to help me sleep through the night, so my mind would be completely relaxed. She stood there waiting, expecting me to consume the drink while she watched. I reached out with a trembling hand, grasping the delicate handle of the cup. As I brought the hot porcelain closer to my face, the harsh light from the reading lamp illuminated the rim. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my breathing steady. Floating just beneath the surface of the dark amber liquid and clinging to the white porcelain edge was a faint, white, chalky residue. It was a powdery substance that had not fully dissolved in the hot water. Cynthia had always been impatient, and her arrogance made her sloppy. She assumed I was too old and grief-stricken to notice a few crushed pills in my nightly beverage. I knew I could not simply refuse the tea. If I rejected her offering, she would find a more direct and forceful method to sedate me, or she might suspect my cognitive decline was a farce. I needed a distraction. I let my hand shake violently, causing a few drops of the hot liquid to spill onto the polished mahogany table. I let out a frustrated sigh, complaining that my hands were failing me. Cynthia rolled her eyes, letting her mask slip for a fraction of a second. She turned her back to me, walking toward the heavy velvet curtains to pull them shut against the storm outside. I had exactly 3 seconds. I moved with the speed and precision of a man fighting for his life. I lunged toward the large potted ficus plant resting in the corner of the study. I tipped the porcelain cup, dumping the steaming poisoned chamomile directly into the dark soil at the base of the thick green plant. I spun back to my chair, grabbing the metal thermos of plain water I always kept beside my armchair. I poured a small amount of lukewarm water into the teacup, swirling it quickly to dissolve the remaining chalky residue. By the time Cynthia turned back around from the windows, I was settling deep into the leather cushions, bringing the cup to my lips. I swallowed the plain water and let out a long, exaggerated breath. Cynthia walked back to the table and picked up the empty porcelain cup. She asked if I felt better. I did not answer immediately. I began the performance of my life. I let my eyelids droop halfway. I slurred my words heavily, mumbling that the room felt incredibly warm and that my tongue felt thick. I allowed my chin to rest against my chest, pretending to lose basic motor control. I tried to stand up, but purposefully let my knees buckle, falling heavily back into the armchair. Cynthia watched me with absolute cold detachment. She did not reach out to catch me. She did not ask if I was experiencing a medical emergency. She simply stood over me, watching my simulated collapse with immense predatory satisfaction. She told me I was just tired and that she would help me to bed. I dragged my feet across the carpet, leaning all my dead weight against her shoulder. She struggled under my weight, panting slightly, as she guided me to the bedroom and let me drop onto the mattress. She turned off the light and closed the door, leaving me in the pitch-black room. I lay perfectly still, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. I stayed awake the entire night, my mind racing with the horrific reality of my situation. Thursday morning brought a terrifying revelation. I woke up early, maintaining my sluggish, confused persona as I navigated the house. Cynthia and Nolan were completely ignoring me now, entirely confident that my brain was melting away under their chemical assault. I slowly shuffled back into my study under the guise of looking for an old book. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked over to the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat. I stared in absolute horror at the large potted ficus plant. Yesterday, the plant had been vibrant, towering, and lush with thick green leaves. Today, it was completely dead. The leaves had turned a sickening shade of black, curling inward like burnt paper. The thick stems were withered and drooping lifelessly over the edge of the ceramic pot. The soil where I had dumped the tea looked unnatural and gray. The sheer toxicity of the substance Cynthia had crushed into my drink was undeniable. The realization crashed into me like a freight train. She was not just trying to make me groggy for a psychiatric evaluation. She was administering massive lethal doses of high-grade sedatives. A normal sleeping pill would not obliterate a mature indoor tree overnight. She was actively poisoning me. She was introducing heavy industrial-grade narcotics into my system, intending to cause permanent neurological damage or induce a fatal cardiac event. The stakes had elevated far beyond financial theft. My life was in imminent physical danger. Every meal she prepared, every glass of water she poured was a potential murder weapon. I was locked inside a house with a woman actively trying to stop my heart. I knew I needed irrefutable proof. I could not just tell the authorities my wife was poisoning my tea. I needed scientific evidence that would hold up in a federal court and completely destroy her defense. I walked over to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out an empty sterile glass vial I used to keep for storing fountain pen ink. I knelt beside the dead ficus plant. The smell of the poisoned earth was acrid and chemical, completely overriding the natural scent of the soil. Using a small silver letter opener, I carefully scraped the topmost layer of the contaminated dirt, where the tea had soaked the deepest. I transferred the dark, toxic soil into the glass vial, filling it to the brim. I screwed the metal cap on, tightly sealing the lethal evidence inside. I slipped the glass vial deep into my pocket, pressing my hand against the cold, hard cylinder. This was the weapon that would ensure Cynthia spent the rest of her miserable life behind steel bars. I had to get this soil sample directly to Attorney Bennett so he could process it through a private, independent toxicology laboratory. The legal trap was almost fully set. My assets were completely shielded in a blind trust. Nolan was drowning in massive syndicate debt. And now I possessed the physical forensic evidence of my wife attempting a premeditated homicide. I just had to survive one more day in this house of horrors before the iron jaws snapped shut around them. With the lethal soil sample safely delivered to Attorney Bennett and my entire financial portfolio locked behind an impenetrable blind trust, I had to leave the house. I could not sit in that leather armchair for another second, waiting for Cynthia to bring me another cup of poisoned tea. I told her I was going to the pharmacy to pick up my heart medication. She barely glanced away from her tablet, simply nodding as she mentally counted down the hours until her fraudulent notary arrived. I climbed into my rusted truck and pointed the hood toward the coast. I was making the 140-mile drive for the second time, but today I was not just observing from the shadows. I was walking through the front door. The highway stretched out before me, bathed in the pale light of an overcast morning. Every mile I drove felt like shedding a layer of the toxic suburban prison I had called home for 40 years. By the time the salty ocean air filled the cabin of my truck, my hands were steady. I parked across the street from Coastal Horizon Architecture. The sleek glass storefront reflected the gray sky. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin, taking a slow, deep breath. I was about to meet my daughter. I had to remain entirely composed. If I broke down and confessed everything right now, I would overwhelm her and potentially compromise the legal trap I had meticulously set for my wife. I had to be Warren the grieving brother, not Warren the long-lost father. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the firm. The quiet hum of productivity filled the bright open space. Several young designers were hunched over drafting tables, but my eyes immediately found her. Natalie was standing near a massive window reviewing a stack of blueprints. When she looked up and saw me standing in the reception area, she froze. Her green eyes, the exact same shade as mine, widened in absolute shock. I approached her slowly, removing my canvas hat. I told her my name was Warren and that I was Russell's younger brother. I said I was clearing out his apartment and found some photographs and letters I thought she might want to have. Natalie dropped her pen. Her hand flew to her mouth and a soft gasp escaped her lips. She closed the distance between us in 3 quick strides and wrapped her arms around my neck. The sudden embrace caught me entirely off guard. For the first time in 35 years, I was holding my child. She smelled of drafting ink and sea breeze. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She told me Russell had spoken about me constantly, but always said I was too busy traveling the world, building my commercial real estate business. She quickly told her team to take an early lunch and guided me out of the office, suggesting we walk down to a quiet coffee shop on the corner. We sat in a small wooden booth near the back of the cafe. The smell of roasted coffee beans and baked cinnamon offered a warm, comforting contrast to the cold reality of my life back home. I slid a small manila envelope across the table. It contained a few benign photographs of Russell holding a fishing rod and some old letters he had kept. I deliberately held back the birth certificate and the infant surrender form. Natalie traced the edge of the envelope with a trembling finger. She looked up at me, offering that warm, crooked smile that belonged entirely to my brother. She told me Uncle Russell was the greatest man she had ever known. She explained how he drove down every second Thursday, without fail, bringing her groceries, paying her rent during college, and making sure her clunky first car always had new brake pads. I listened in absolute silence, my heart breaking a little more with every word. I asked her what Russell had told her about her parents. I braced myself for the answer, terrified that she knew she had been abandoned. Natalie took a sip of her coffee, her gaze drifting out the window toward the ocean. She said Uncle Russell told her that her parents were brilliant, adventurous people who loved her very much. She recounted the story he had constructed for her. He claimed my parents died in a tragic car accident on a rainy highway when I was just a few weeks old. She said Russell told her he took her in because it was what his brother would have wanted. He built a beautiful, tragic lie to completely shield her from the devastating reality of Cynthia's monstrous betrayal. He wanted her to grow up feeling loved and cherished rather than discarded and unwanted. He spared her the agonizing trauma of rejection. I stared into my black coffee, fighting a desperate battle to keep the tears from spilling over my eyelids. I was overwhelmed with a profound, crushing gratitude for the mechanic who lived in poverty just to fund this beautiful lie. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to remain steady. I told her that Russell was right, and that her father would have been incredibly proud of the woman she had become. She smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, I felt like a father sitting across from his successful, brilliant child. The connection was instant and undeniable, but the peace of that moment shattered instantly. Natalie withdrew her hand, and her expression shifted from warm nostalgia to genuine confusion. She asked me if Russell had any other siblings, or perhaps a very aggressive ex-wife. I shook my head, stating that it was just the two of us. I asked her why she was inquiring about that. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a disturbing secret. She told me that a strange woman had called the architectural firm late yesterday afternoon. The receptionist had transferred the call to Natalie, assuming it was a new client. But the woman on the phone did not want to discuss blueprints. Natalie described the caller voice as sharp, nasal, and incredibly demanding. The caller had aggressively demanded to speak to whoever was listed as Russell's primary financial beneficiary. The woman claimed she was conducting an urgent audit of his meager estate and insisted on knowing exactly what assets were hidden in this coastal town. Natalie said the woman sounded frantic, almost threatening, and kept demanding a physical address. My blood turned to absolute ice. The description of that sharp, nasal, commanding voice was unmistakable. It was Cynthia. While I was busy hiding my assets and running toxicology reports, my wife had not been sitting idle. She had somehow found a discrepancy. Perhaps she had tracked the mileage on my truck, or found a stray toll receipt I had forgotten to destroy. She had discovered the 140-mile route and was actively hunting for the destination. Cynthia believed Russell had hoarded a secret fortune, and she was determined to pillage it before I supposedly lost my mind entirely. She was calling businesses in the coastal area, blindly searching for a connection to my dead brother. It was only a matter of time before her ruthless persistence uncovered Natalie's true identity. If Cynthia realized that the infant she threw away 35 years ago was still alive and thriving, she would not just be furious. She would recognize Natalie as the ultimate legal threat to her hostile takeover of my estate. Cynthia would unleash her expensive lawyers to terrorize my daughter, dragging her name through the mud and attempting to seize the architectural firm out of pure spite. I looked at Natalie sitting across from me, completely unaware of the lethal predator currently circling her life. I forced a calm, reassuring smile onto my face, hiding the absolute panic screaming through my veins. I told Natalie it was probably just an aggressive debt collector trying to scam grieving relatives. I promised her I would handle the situation and ensure the woman never called her office again. I stood up from the wooden booth, knowing my timeline had just evaporated. I could not wait until Friday to spring my trap. I had to get back to the suburbs immediately. The monster was out of the cage and she was hunting my child. I drove the 140 miles back to the suburbs with my foot heavy on the accelerator. My mind was a frantic labyrinth of calculations and contingencies. Cynthia was actively hunting for a ghost, and I needed to give her a massive, shiny distraction to pull her gaze away from the coast. Greed was her ultimate fundamental weakness. If I presented her with an immediate financial feast right under her nose, she would abandon her frantic phone calls to coastal businesses and focus entirely on the imminent payout. I pulled my rusted truck into my pristine driveway, determined to play the most degrading role of my entire life. I had to become the perfect victim. I shuffled through the front door, dragging my muddy boots across the expensive Persian rugs in the foyer. The atmosphere inside the house had shifted dramatically since yesterday morning. The tense, hushed whispers and careful plotting were completely gone. In their place was a brazen, arrogant celebration. Designer shopping bags littered the hallway floor, smelling of expensive leather and luxury boutiques. From the living room, I heard the distinct popping of a champagne cork, followed by Valerie letting out a loud, triumphant laugh. I crept toward the doorway and observed the sickening spectacle unfolding in my home. Nolan was sitting on the imported Italian leather sofa, typing furiously into a brand-new high-end platinum laptop. Valerie was admiring a massive diamond tennis bracelet draped across her wrist, holding it up to catch the light from the chandelier. Cynthia was standing near the fireplace, pouring herself another glass of vintage champagne. They were spending money like lottery winners. My money. They were absolutely convinced that the court order scheduled for Friday was a mere formality, and they were burning through my available credit lines to appease the illegal sports betting syndicate while simultaneously rewarding their own vanity. I let my shoulders slump forward, curving my spine until I looked small and fragile. I walked into the room with a vacant, glassy stare, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. Nolan barely glanced at me, simply rolling his eyes and muttering to his wife that the walking corpse had finally returned from wandering the streets. Cynthia offered a cold, mocking smile. She told me to go sit in my corner and be quiet because the adults were handling very complicated business. I shuffled over to my worn leather armchair and sank heavily into the cushions. I stared blankly at the dark television screen, becoming nothing more than a piece of invisible furniture to them. While I sat there drooling slightly for dramatic effect, my smartphone vibrated silently in my deep canvas jacket pocket. Every time Nolan hit a key on his new laptop, my phone registered a high-dollar transaction. $10,000 to a luxury car dealership for a down payment. $15,000 to an offshore payment processor directly linked to his gambling debts. $5,000 to an elite country club to cover Valerie overdue membership fees. I kept my eyes completely glazed over, maintaining my dead stare, while my thumb blindly felt for the screen of my phone. With practiced precision, I pressed the forward button, sending every single automated bank alert directly to Attorney Bennett. Miles away in his secure downtown office, Bennett was not just watching these alerts flash across his monitors. He was meticulously cataloging them. He was building an ironclad digital cage of felony wire fraud and grand larceny. Every fraudulent transfer Nolan executed across state lines added another 10 years to his impending federal prison sentence. They were weaving their own criminal noose while laughing and drinking champagne in my living room. I sat in that armchair for 3 agonizing hours, enduring their endless insults. Valerie complained loudly about the smell of my old canvas jacket, saying it made the house reek of poverty. Cynthia joked that they should just lock me in the garage until the men with the straitjackets arrived on Friday. I absorbed every single toxic word, letting their supreme arrogance blind them to the lethal trap closing rapidly around their throats. I needed Cynthia to feel absolutely secure in her victory. When she finally walked over to examine me, I let out a soft, confused whimper and asked her what year it was. She laughed out loud, a cruel, piercing sound, and patted my cheek as if I were a stray dog. She told Nolan to transfer another $20,000 to his offshore account, claiming I would not even remember my own name by tomorrow morning, let alone my banking passwords. The distraction was working perfectly. She had entirely forgotten about the coastal town and the mysterious beneficiary. She was too intoxicated by the immediate access to my credit lines. Around midnight, the vintage champagne took its toll, and the 3 of them finally retreated to the upstairs master suites, leaving their mess behind. I waited until the house was entirely silent, until the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I dropped the senile act instantly. I stood up, stretching my aching spine, and walked quietly into the gourmet kitchen for a glass of cold water. The marble island was covered in empty bottles, velvet jewelry boxes, and discarded receipts from their wild shopping spree. But something else caught my eye under the dim glow of the stove light. Resting carelessly near the espresso machine was a thick stack of stapled papers. Valerie had always been incredibly disorganized, but leaving this document out in the open was a catastrophic mistake. I picked up the heavy legal packet. The header did not bear the name of any legitimate bank or lending institution. It listed a notorious shell company widely known by federal authorities for laundering money for organized crime syndicates. My blood ran completely cold as I read the fine print illuminated by the faint kitchen light. It was a highly predatory, aggressive loan agreement. Nolan had forged my signature perfectly at the bottom of the page, taking out an immediate emergency cash advance to cover his mounting syndicate interest. But the loan was not unsecured. Under the collateral section, Nolan had listed the deed to this exact house. He had legally pledged the roof over my head to violent underground loan sharks. The document stipulated that if the payment did not clear by Friday morning, the syndicate would hold a legitimate claim to the property. They would not wait for a court order or a judge ruling. They would arrive with weapons to physically claim their real estate. The ticking clock had just accelerated to a terrifying speed. I did not just have to protect my long-lost daughter from Cynthia legal attacks. I had to drop the hammer immediately before dangerous criminals knocked down my front door and dragged me out into the street. The shell game was over. It was time to spring the trap. The morning light was thick and gray when the heavy bedroom door swung open. I had barely slept, keeping my eyes fixed on the ceiling while calculating the exact timeline of my impending counterstrike. Cynthia marched into the room holding a stiff wool sweater and a pair of trousers. Her face was tight, completely stripped of the fake maternal warmth she had displayed the night before. Nolan stood right behind her in the hallway, tapping his phone frantically. The syndicate loan weighed on them like an anvil, and their credit card shopping spree was not going to satisfy the violent men waiting for a massive cash payment. They needed liquid capital immediately. They needed my primary checking account. Cynthia threw the clothes onto the foot of my bed. She ordered me to get up and get dressed. She spoke to me as if I were a disobedient child dragging his feet on the way to school. She told me we were going to the bank to handle some routine paperwork for my own protection. I let my jaw drop slightly, putting on my best vacant stare. I fumbled with the buttons of my shirt, intentionally fastening them incorrectly to project severe cognitive decline. Cynthia sighed loudly, stepping forward to forcefully yank the fabric and redo the buttons herself. Her hands were rough, her fingernails digging sharply into my skin. I did not react. I remained perfectly docile, a hollow shell of a man ready to be led to the slaughter. The car ride to the downtown financial plaza was suffocating. Nolan drove aggressively, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned entirely white. He kept looking at the rearview mirror, jumping at every dark vehicle that pulled up behind us. The loan sharks were circling, and my son was drowning in absolute terror. Cynthia sat in the passenger seat, clutching a leather folder that contained Dr. Eris and his fraudulent medical evaluation. She rehearsed her lines under her breath, practicing the exact tone of a devastated wife forced to take control of her husband's failing mind. I sat in the back seat, staring blankly out the window, committing every single detail of their panic to memory. We arrived at my primary bank branch just after 10 in the morning. It was a stately building with high vaulted ceilings and polished marble floors. I had done business here for over 2 decades. The branch manager was a sharp, observant man named Mr. Jenkins. I had personally helped finance his daughter's college tuition through a commercial scholarship program 10 years ago. Cynthia grabbed me by the elbow the moment we stepped out of the vehicle, steering me through the heavy glass doors with an iron grip. She marched us directly past the teller line and straight toward the manager's glass-enclosed office. Mr. Jenkins stood up from his desk, looking surprised by the sudden intrusion. Cynthia offered him a brilliant, tragic smile. She guided me into a chair, pressing her hand heavily onto my shoulder to ensure I stayed put. She sat down across from the desk and handed over the forged medical document with a perfectly timed sigh of exhaustion. She told Mr. Jenkins that my mind was rapidly deteriorating and that it was breaking her heart to see me suffer. She explained that Dr. Aris had officially recommended she take immediate temporary control of my primary checking account to pay for specialized in-home care. Nolan stood hovering near the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot, demanding that the transfer of $400,000 be wired to his corporate account immediately for safekeeping. Mr. Jenkins took the paperwork. He put on his reading glasses and reviewed the forged signature. Federal banking regulations regarding elder financial abuse are incredibly strict, and a sudden demand to wire $400,000 by a frantic family member is the ultimate red flag. He looked over the rim of his glasses directly at me. He asked me how I was doing today and if I understood what my wife and son were requesting. This was my moment. The stage was set and the audience was watching. I let my eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated panic. I shrank back against the leather chair, pulling my knees toward my chest. I looked at Nolan as if I had never seen him a single day in my life. I let out a loud, trembling gasp. I pointed a shaking finger at my own son and yelled, asking who this strange man was and why he was following me. My voice echoed loudly through the open office door, spilling out into the quiet bank lobby. Nolan turned pale. He stepped forward, trying to quiet me down, but I instantly recoiled. I threw my hands over my head and screamed for him to get away from me. I cried out that I did not have a son. I knocked over a heavy cup of pens on the desk, sending them clattering loudly across the polished floor. I turned to Cynthia, shrinking away from her touch, wailing that she was a stranger trying to steal my wallet. I begged Mr. Jenkins to call the police because these people had forced me into their car. The performance was absolute chaos. Customers in the lobby stopped what they were doing and stared in horror. Tellers picked up their desk phones. Cynthia panicked desperately, trying to grab my arm and hush my cries, but her aggressive movements only made the situation look infinitely worse. She hissed at me to shut up, her mask completely slipping in front of the branch manager. Nolan slammed his fist down hard on the wooden desk, demanding that Mr. Jenkins process the wire transfer immediately or face a massive lawsuit. That violent action sealed their fate. Mr. Jenkins stood up slowly, his face hardened with absolute professional authority. He ignored Nolan entirely and pressed the silent security alarm beneath his desk. He informed Cynthia that based on my severe visible distress and the aggressive nature of their demands, he was legally obligated to refuse the transaction. He stated clearly that under federal law he was placing a hard immediate freeze on all my accounts for suspected coercion and elder financial abuse. Cynthia's face twisted into a mask of pure demonic rage. She demanded the money, claiming the medical evaluation gave her absolute legal right. Mr. Jenkins calmly replied that a single piece of paper did not override a suspected kidnapping and extortion attempt right inside his office. 2 large armed security guards appeared in the doorway, resting their hands near their utility belts. They ordered Cynthia and Nolan to step away from me and vacate the premises immediately. Realizing that a physical altercation would end with them leaving in police handcuffs, Cynthia violently grabbed her leather folder. She ordered Nolan to leave. They knew if they abandoned me there, I might accidentally reveal their entire scheme to the authorities in my simulated panic state. Cynthia grabbed my jacket, pulling me up from the chair with a brutal yank. She apologized sweetly to the guards, claiming I was just having a terrible, severe episode and that they were taking me straight to the hospital. I continued to whimper and shake, letting them drag me out of the bank doors in front of 30 witnesses. The drive back to the house was completely devoid of any pretending. The silence inside the vehicle was thick with lethal desperation. Nolan was hyperventilating, punching the steering wheel at every red light. The bank freeze meant they were entirely locked out of the cash they needed today. The syndicate would not receive their payment. The violent loan sharks would be coming to collect their collateral by tomorrow morning. Their entire criminal operation was collapsing around them, and they had absolutely no financial leverage left. Cynthia turned around in her passenger seat to face me in the back. Her eyes were completely black, devoid of any human soul. The false sweetness was gone, eradicated by pure venom. She leaned close to my face, her breath smelling of bitter coffee and malice. She told me to listen very carefully. She stated that the games were completely over. She promised me that if I did not sit quietly and sign the final legal guardianship papers tomorrow afternoon, she would make sure I suffered. She looked me dead in the eyes and promised that she would lock me away in a state-run facility that still uses heavy chemical restraints and straitjackets. She swore she would leave me to rot in a padded room where no one would ever hear me scream. I shrank back against the leather seat, trembling outwardly, while maintaining my blank, terrified stare. Inside my chest, my heart beat with a steady, triumphant rhythm. I did not get the money, and neither did they. Things had gotten significantly worse for my enemies. The countdown was nearly complete. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, the real destruction would begin. I sat in the dark stillness of my study, watching the heavy rain slide down the glass window panes. My burner phone vibrated against the wooden desk. It was Attorney Bennett. The independent laboratory had expedited the soil sample analysis, and the results were not just positive, they were horrifying. The dirt I had scraped from the dead ficus plant contained massive lethal concentrations of industrial-grade benzodiazepines. It was a dosage specifically designed to stop a human heart entirely perfectly disguised as a calming herbal tea. Cynthia was not just planning to commit me to a psychiatric ward, she was actively laying the groundwork for a fatal overdose, one that her corrupt hired doctor would easily write off as natural heart failure in a grieving, exhausted old man. The clinical, undeniable proof of my wife attempting premeditated murder erased any lingering hesitation I had left in my soul. I was no longer just fighting for my financial assets. I was fighting for my actual life. I packed the official laboratory report into a thick leather envelope. I added the yellowed infant surrender form from 1991 and the photographs from Russell Hidden's steel box. I also included a certified document I had obtained just hours ago. Bennett had used his extensive federal contacts to expedite a rapid genetic test comparing my medical records with the DNA. I had discreetly pulled from a coffee cup Natalie used during our first meeting at the cafe. The match was absolute and irrefutable. She was my biological daughter. I slipped out of the house through the garage, bypassing the security cameras, and taking my truck out into the cold morning air. The drive was a blur of gray asphalt and churning violent thoughts. This was the third time I was making this 140-mile journey, but this time there were no secrets left to hide and no lies left to protect. I arrived at the coastal town just as the midday sun broke through the dense morning fog. I parked across the street from Coastal Horizon Architecture. My hands felt incredibly heavy as I gripped the steering wheel. I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on an innocent woman. I was about to tell her that the mother who brought her into this world had discarded her like defective garbage, and that the man sitting across from her was the father who had unknowingly abandoned her to a life of hidden struggle. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the firm. The office was quieter today, with most of the staff out for lunch. Natalie was alone at her large wooden drafting table, illuminated by the bright skylight above, meticulously drawing lines on a new commercial blueprint. She looked up and smiled, that warm, familiar smile, clearly surprised to see me back so soon. I did not smile back. I turned around, locked the glass front door, and flipped the small open sign to closed. Natalie stood up, her expression shifting to immediate concern. She asked me if something was wrong, and if that aggressive woman had called her office again. I walked over to her drafting table, my boots heavy on the polished wooden floor. I told her I needed her to sit down and listen to me without saying a single word until I was completely finished. I reached into the leather envelope and placed the documents on the smooth surface of the table, one by one. I started with the infant surrender form from 35 years ago. I watched her green eyes scan the aged paper, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she read the cold, clinical terms of parental abandonment. Then I pointed a trembling finger to the signature at the bottom of the page. I told her that signature belonged to my wife, Cynthia. I explained that in 1991, Cynthia had given birth to a baby girl with severe respiratory issues and had legally surrendered her to the state while I was thousands of miles away, working on an offshore drilling rig. I told her that my wife had lied to my face, claiming the child had died in the hospital, forcing me to mourn over an empty memorial plaque. Natalie stared at me, her breathing becoming shallow, her hands gripping the edge of the drafting table so hard her knuckles turned white. Before she could process the shock, I placed the expedited genetic match report right next to the surrender form. I told her the absolute truth. I told her I was not just Russell's brother passing on some old nostalgic belongings. I told her I was her biological father. I confessed that Russell had somehow discovered Cynthia's monstrous betrayal, stepped in to rescue her from the foster system, and drove 140 miles every second Thursday to fund her entire existence. He had lived his whole life in crushing poverty to protect her from the woman who threw her away. I laid out the toxicology report next, explaining the lethal physical danger I was currently facing back home. I detailed the fake psychiatric evaluation, the stolen money, the impending threat from the violent gambling syndicate, and the absolute destruction my family had planned for me by Friday afternoon. Natalie did not scream. She did not cry immediately. She stood frozen, staring at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Her eyes tracked back and forth between the DNA results and the surrender form. The silence in the architectural firm was absolute and suffocating, heavy with the weight of 35 years of stolen history. When she finally looked up at me, the warmth in her green eyes was completely gone. In its place was a profound, shattering devastation. A single tear slipped down her cheek, dropping silently onto the blueprint beneath her hands. She whispered my brother's name, realizing the sheer agonizing magnitude of the sacrifice Russell had made. He had denied himself a family and died a lonely mechanic just to shield her from this exact horrific truth. I expected her to ask me to leave the building. I expected her to need space to process the massive trauma of her true origin. But as the tears dried on her face, a powerful physical transformation occurred. The devastation crystallized into something incredibly dangerous. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, and the grief in her eyes hardened into pure, unadulterated, righteous fury. She picked up the toxicology report, reading the lethal dosage levels of the sedative Cynthia had tried to feed me. She looked at the forged loan documents that placed my life in the crosshairs of a criminal syndicate. The woman who had thrown her away was now actively trying to murder the father who had finally come to find her. I told her my lawyers had established a blind trust in her name, securing my entire $2.5 million estate so Cynthia and Nolan could never touch a single cent. I promised her I would handle the legal slaughter tomorrow, and that she needed to stay completely hidden on the coast to remain perfectly safe from the fallout. Natalie slammed her hand down on the drafting table. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the empty office. She utterly refused. Her voice was sharp and commanding, mirroring the exact ruthless tone I used in corporate boardrooms when a negotiation turned hostile. She told me Russell had spent his entire life hiding her in the shadows to keep her safe, and she was completely done hiding. She demanded to be in the room when the trap was finally sprung. She insisted on standing face to face with the mother who had discarded her and the half-brother who was trying to steal her legacy. She wanted to watch their privileged, predatory world burn to ash right in front of her eyes. I looked at my daughter, seeing the fierce, unbreakable iron in her posture. She was not a fragile victim needing my protection. She was a warrior built from my blood and raised by my brother, unwavering loyalty. I nodded slowly, accepting her non-negotiable terms. I told her to pack a bag because we were driving back to the city together. The predators waiting in my suburban house thought they had successfully isolated a broken, senile old man. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow morning they would be facing a united front. They were about to meet the ghost they created 35 years ago, and she was coming for everything they loved. I left Natalie in a secure executive suite at a discreet downtown hotel far away from my suburban neighborhood. I paid for the room in cash, ensuring there was no digital paper trail for Cynthia to track. Natalie understood the assignment perfectly. She was to remain entirely out of sight until I gave the signal. Driving back to the estate, my mind was a steel trap. The grief that had weighed me down since the cemetery was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation. I pulled the truck into the driveway, taking a deep breath of the humid morning air. I was walking back into the lion's den, but this time I was carrying the match that would burn it to the ground. I entered the house, dragging my boots and letting my shoulders slump. The house was quiet. I navigated to my study and slept in my leather armchair, refusing to touch anything Cynthia might have prepared. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating tension. This was the day Cynthia had scheduled the corrupt notary. This was the day I was supposed to be legally erased. I walked into the sprawling kitchen where Cynthia and Nolan were aggressively whispering over a cup of black coffee. Valerie was leaning against the marble island, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. They stopped talking the moment I shuffled into the room. Cynthia pasted on her false, sickeningly sweet smile and asked how my head was feeling today. I did not answer immediately. I walked over to the counter and poured myself a glass of tap water, my hand trembling perfectly on cue. I looked at Cynthia with wide, confused eyes. I told her that I had a strange dream last night about Russell. I let my voice crack, feigning a moment of desperate lucidity pushing through the supposed mental fog. I told them that the funeral must have jogged a deeply buried memory. I mumbled that I remembered a conversation Russell and I had years ago about a secondary will. The kitchen went absolutely dead silent. Nolan lowered his coffee mug, his eyes narrowing with sudden, intense interest. I kept my gaze fixed on the granite countertop, playing the broken old man, trying to piece together a fragmented mind. I told them Russell had secured a massive payout from a mechanical patent he sold decades ago. I lied seamlessly, weaving a story about how my brother had hidden the money because he did not trust banks or the government. I told them he placed the entire fortune into a secure commercial safe deposit box located in the financial district. I whispered that the box contained millions of dollars in untraceable bearer bonds and gold certificates. I saw Valerie look up from her phone, her eyes widening with absolute unrestrained greed. Cynthia took a slow, deliberate step toward me. She asked me where this safe deposit box was located, her voice trembling with a sudden desperate hunger. I told her I could not remember the exact bank, but I remembered the lawyer who held the secondary will and the physical keys. I gave them the name of Attorney Bennett. I told them Bennett was the only man who could legally authorize the opening of the vault, and that I was the sole named beneficiary. I watched the realization wash over my wife and son. The medical incompetence plan suddenly became a massive, catastrophic liability to them. If they declared me legally incompetent today, the state might freeze the sudden inheritance or subject the newly discovered millions to a lengthy probate investigation. They needed me legally lucid just long enough to claim Russell's hidden fortune and sign it directly over to them. The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous and entirely sickening. The corrupt notary was forgotten. The urgent psychiatric evaluation was permanently shelved. Greed completely overrode their cautious, predatory planning. Nolan pulled out his phone and immediately canceled his morning meetings. He told Cynthia that the syndicate loan could be paid off in full today, with plenty of capital left over to fund his failing startup indefinitely. Valerie practically vibrated with excitement, loudly declaring that they needed to go downtown right this second, before the lawyer closed his office for the weekend. They were abandoning their carefully constructed medical fraud for the promise of immediate untraceable wealth. The bait had been swallowed whole, and the hook was set deep in their throats. They treated the impending meeting like a guaranteed lottery payout. The anxiety of the looming syndicate debt completely vanished from Nolan's posture. He practically ran upstairs to change his clothes. Cynthia told me to go wash my face and put on a nice suit, acting as if we were preparing for a celebratory gala rather than a legal reading. I walked to the master bathroom, moving slowly to maintain the illusion, while my heart hammered a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I dressed in a dark, tailored suit, adjusting my tie with perfectly steady hands. When I returned to the foyer, they were waiting. The sheer vanity of my family was on full display. Cynthia wore a pristine white designer dress adorned with heavy gold jewelry that caught the light of the chandelier. She looked like a woman preparing to step onto a red carpet. Valerie wore a tailored silk blazer and held a luxury handbag that cost more than my brother made in a year. Nolan wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit, his hair slicked back, his chest puffed out with absolute arrogance. They looked like royalty preparing to collect their rightful tribute. They smelled of expensive perfume and imported cologne, a sickening cloud of entitlement that filled the entryway. I stood beside them in silence, playing the confused old man, shuffling my feet and staring blankly at the front door. The car ride to the financial district was a masterclass in grotesque delusion. Nolan drove his imported sports car with aggressive, careless speed, weaving through highway traffic, while loudly calculating how he would distribute the millions. Valerie sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her phone, talking about upgrading to a gated compound in the hills. Cynthia sat in the back seat next to me, patting my knee with that same false maternal affection she had used while crushing sedatives into my tea. She told me everything was going to be wonderful, and that this money would ensure I received the best possible care for the rest of my failing life. She promised me a peaceful, comfortable retirement, completely unaware that I had already secured the forensic evidence of her attempted murder. I nodded weakly, staring out the window, counting down the miles to their absolute destruction. We arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that housed Attorney Bennett's firm. The underground parking garage was cool and silent. Nolan practically sprinted to the elevator, pressing the button for the 50th floor with frantic energy. The ascent was fast, making my ears pop, but my family did not notice anything other than their own impending wealth. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the sleek, minimalist lobby of the corporate litigation firm. The receptionist, a sharp professional woman in a dark suit, stood up from behind her marble desk. She did not ask for our names. She simply stated that Mr. Bennett was expecting us and instructed us to follow her down the main corridor. The hallway was lined with thick, frosted glass and modern art. Cynthia walked with her head held high, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. Valerie linked her arm through Nolan, projecting the image of a powerful, successful couple about to conquer the world. I dragged my feet behind them, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, playing the final minutes of my role. The receptionist led us to the main executive conference room at the end of the hall. It was a massive space dominated by a long, polished mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city below. She opened the heavy wooden double doors and gestured for us to enter. Cynthia walked in first, followed immediately by Nolan and Valerie. I stepped across the threshold, last moving slowly. The moment my foot cleared the doorway, the receptionist pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut. A loud, heavy magnetic thud echoed through the room as the electronic locks engaged simultaneously. The sudden, absolute finality of that sound caused Nolan to flinch. He turned around, grabbing the brass door handle and pulling. It did not budge. The room was completely sealed. The arrogant smiles began to falter, melting into genuine confusion. Attorney Bennett sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table. He did not stand to greet them. He did not offer a polite smile or extend his hand. He wore a dark charcoal suit, his hands resting flat on the polished wood. The atmosphere in the conference room was entirely devoid of the celebratory energy my family had brought with them. The air was incredibly cold, sterile, and heavy with impending doom. There were no legal documents scattered across the table. There were no safe deposit box keys waiting to be handed over. There was no hidden fortune sitting in a briefcase. Cynthia stepped forward, her golden jewelry clinking softly in the quiet room. She asked Bennett where the secondary will was located, her voice trembling with the first tiny trace of panic. Bennett did not answer her. He simply reached out and pressed a small silver button on his desk console. The heavy motorized blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows began to hum, sliding downward and plunging the luxurious conference room into deep shadows. A high-definition projector mounted on the ceiling suddenly whirred to life. A bright, stark rectangle of light hit the blank white wall at the far end of the room. I stood by the locked doors, dropping my wooden cane to the floor. The hollow clatter echoed loudly. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back and shedding the frail, senile persona instantly. My family turned to look at me, their eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror, as they realized the lottery they thought they had won was actually an iron cage. The heavy wooden cane clattered against the hardwood floor. The hollow sound echoed through the dark conference room. I did not bend down to pick it up. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling my spine align and my chest expand. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. The vacant, glazed look in my eyes dissolved, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus that had built a commercial real estate empire. I looked at the three people standing near the locked doors. Cynthia swallowed hard. Nolan took a small step backward. Valerie clutched her expensive handbag as if it could somehow protect her. The illusion of the broken, grieving old man evaporated into the cold, conditioned air. I turned my attention to the head of the long mahogany table. I told Bennett to turn it on. My voice was no longer a confused mumble. It cut through the silence like a freshly sharpened razor. It was the exact tone I used when a hostile negotiation was about to end in total ruin for the opposition. Attorney Bennett did not say a single word. He simply pressed a button on his remote control. The high-definition projector hummed loudly. A bright, blinding rectangle of light hit the blank wall at the end of the room. The first document materialized on the screen in massive, crisp letters. It was the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation bearing the signature of the corrupt Dr. Eris. The document detailed my supposed severe cognitive decline and my total legal incompetence. Cynthia gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. I watched her perfectly manicured facade begin to crack. I told them this was the fake medical record they purchased for $20,000. I explained that I knew exactly how they had planned to use it to seize my estate by Friday afternoon. Nolan opened his mouth to speak, but Bennett pressed the button again before a single lie could escape my son's lips. The screen shifted from a static document to a moving high-resolution video. The footage was captured from the hidden security camera I had discreetly activated in my study. The video showed Cynthia standing near the small wooden table. It showed her looking over her shoulder with cold, calculated paranoia before reaching into her pocket. The entire room watched in absolute horror as the 50-foot projection displayed my wife crushing a handful of pills and dumping the white powder directly into my porcelain teacup. Valerie let out a sharp, terrified squeak. She backed away from her mother-in-law, her eyes wide with sudden realization. Cynthia began to shake, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I did not give her a single moment to recover. I commanded Bennett to show the next slide. The projector flashed again, displaying a certified toxicology report from the Metropolitan Hospital emergency room. I read the results out loud, letting my voice boom across the conference table. I announced the presence of lethal industrial-grade sedatives in the soil sample taken from the dead ficus plant in my study. I looked directly at Cynthia and told her that her special chamomile tea was a premeditated attempt to induce a fatal cardiac event. I told her that she was not just a thief, but an attempted murderer. Nolan stepped forward, his face flushed with panicked anger. He tried to claim that this was all a massive misunderstanding, and that he had absolutely no idea what his mother was doing. He tried to distance himself from the sinking ship, but his own destruction was already queued up on the projector. Bennett clicked the remote control once more. The screen filled with dense, complex financial spreadsheets. They were the precise digital records of the offshore wire transfers Nolan had executed from his laptop while sitting on my living room sofa. Red circles highlighted the massive sums of money flowing directly from his fraudulent accounts to the illegal sports betting syndicate. I looked at my son and felt absolutely nothing. No pity and no paternal instinct. I told him I knew about the $400,000 debt. I told him I knew about the violent loan sharks he had invited to my front door. I pointed to the screen and revealed that he had forged my signature on a predatory loan agreement using my house as collateral to save his own life. Nolan collapsed into one of the leather conference chairs, burying his face in his hands. He knew the federal wire fraud documentation displayed on the wall carried a mandatory prison sentence. Valerie began to weep hysterically, realizing her luxurious lifestyle was completely over and that her husband was a desperate criminal. Cynthia, however, refused to surrender. Decades of arrogant privilege had convinced her she could manipulate any situation. She stepped toward the center of the room, pointing a trembling finger at the projection screen. She screamed that the documents were entirely fabricated. She yelled that I was suffering from severe hallucinations, and that grief had completely detached me from reality. She turned to Attorney Bennett, demanding that he call a hospital immediately. She claimed I was having a dangerous psychotic episode and that I needed to be heavily medicated for my own safety. She tried to use the very narrative she had invented to gaslight the room. She looked at Nolan, demanding that he stand up and help her control his deranged father. But Nolan did not move. He was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the irrefutable proof of his own felonies. Cynthia realized she was losing control. She raised her voice louder, insisting that I was a broken old man who had simply lost his mind after burying his brother. She screamed that she had been a devoted, loving wife for 40 years, and that I had absolutely no right to accuse her of such horrific crimes. I let her scream until her voice grew hoarse. I let her exhaust her supply of toxic lies. I stood perfectly still, watching her panic escalate into pure, unfiltered desperation. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I turned to the lawyer. I told Bennett to show them the last document. The projector clicked. The financial spreadsheets vanished. A single yellowed, aged piece of paper appeared on the wall. The contrast and brightness had been enhanced, so every single faded word was legible. It was the 1991 infant surrender form. The silence that slammed into the conference room was absolute and suffocating. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out through the ventilation system. Cynthia stared at the massive projection of her own elegant cursive signature at the bottom of the legal document. All the blood completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her jaw trembled, but no sound came out. The arrogant, defiant woman vanished, replaced by a terrified, exposed monster. Nolan lifted his head from his hands. He squinted at the screen, reading the words out loud. He read the name of the mother. He read the date. He read the official state seal confirming the total abandonment of a newborn child with severe respiratory complications. He slowly turned his head to look at his mother. The confusion in his eyes rapidly morphed into a horrifying realization. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, deadly precision. I told Nolan that while I was breaking my back on an overseas oil rig trying to provide a future for our family, his mother had thrown his baby sister away. I told him she claimed the child died in the hospital because she did not want the social burden of raising a sick infant. I told him that she forced me to mourn over an empty grave for 35 years. Nolan stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. He stared at Cynthia with absolute revulsion. He asked her if it was true. He asked her if she had lied about a dead baby just to maintain her perfect country club lifestyle. Cynthia tried to reach out to him, her hands shaking violently, but Nolan slapped her arm away with brutal force. He stumbled backward, looking at the woman who raised him as if she were a venomous snake. The criminal alliance they had formed to destroy me completely shattered in that exact moment. They were no longer a united front plotting to steal my wealth. They were two exposed predators turning on each other in a locked room. Valerie backed against the heavy mahogany doors, weeping loudly, as she realized the true depths of the depravity surrounding her. Cynthia fell to her knees on the expensive carpet, sobbing and clutching her chest. Her 35-year-old lie had finally caught up to her, tearing her family apart in front of her golden child. The trap had successfully sprung, and the iron jaws were locked tight. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room had been magnetically sealed, but suddenly a loud, sharp click echoed through the tense air. The electronic locks disengaged. The tall doors slowly pushed inward, gliding silently on their brass hinges. The room, which had been suffocating under the weight of Cynthia and her exposed 35-year-old lie, suddenly felt flooded with a new, shifting energy. A woman stepped across the threshold. She walked with a quiet, confident authority, her posture perfectly straight, her expression an unreadable mask of absolute resolve. She moved past the weeping Valerie and the paralyzed Nolan. She did not stop until she reached the far end of the long, polished table, taking her rightful place, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. I placed my hand gently on her back, a silent gesture of absolute solidarity. Natalie stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate office, looking directly at the woman who had brought her into the world and immediately thrown her away. The physical resemblance was an undeniable, striking reality. Natalie possessed the same high cheekbones, the same elegant bone structure that Cynthia had always flaunted at her country club galas. But where Cynthia's features were hardened by decades of predatory greed and selfish vanity, Natalie's face was illuminated by a fierce, intelligent strength. The ghost of Cynthia, past the infant she had discarded like defective garbage, was standing right in front of her, a brilliant, successful architect who had survived without a single drop of her mother's corrupted wealth. Cynthia looked up from the carpet where she had fallen. Her eyes locked onto Natalie, and the reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Cynthia physically recoiled, scrambling backward on her hands and knees until her back slammed against the heavy wooden leg of the conference table. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as if she were looking at a terrifying apparition. She knew exactly who this woman was. The lie she had meticulously maintained to control me, to isolate me, to make me mourn an empty grave had just walked into the room to deliver her final judgment. Nolan stared at the newcomer, his mind struggling to process the sudden arrival. He looked back and forth between Natalie and his mother as trying to assemble the fragmented pieces of his shattered reality. I broke the suffocating silence, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. I introduced Natalie to the room. I told Nolan that this was his older sister, the baby his mother had abandoned to the state system 35 years ago. I explained that Russell, the uncle they had mocked and belittled, had rescued her and raised her in a quiet coastal town, protecting her from the toxic poison of our household. I told them that the man they laughed at during his funeral was a hero who sacrificed his entire existence so my daughter could live a life completely untouched by their relentless greed. Valerie began to hyperventilate, clutching her expensive handbag as the reality of the situation fully materialized in her mind. She realized that the sudden appearance of a legitimate older sibling meant the absolute destruction of their exclusive inheritance. Nolan stammered, his voice cracking, as he asked me what this meant for the estate and the bridge loan he desperately needed to appease the violent sports betting syndicate. He begged me to listen to reason, claiming they could still handle this quietly as a family. He promised he would get help for his gambling addiction if I just authorized the release of the $200,000 right now. I looked at my son and felt a profound, chilling emptiness. I told him that he was incredibly late to be negotiating terms. I instructed him to listen very carefully to the next words I spoke. I announced that as of yesterday morning, Attorney Bennett and his legal team had successfully executed a series of irrevocable ghost protocols. I explained that my entire $2.5 million retirement portfolio, every single mutual fund, and every liquid asset had been legally funneled into a massive blind trust. I told them that the sprawling suburban estate they currently lived in, the house Nolan had fraudulently leveraged as collateral to illegal loan sharks, was now the sole property of that same trust. I turned to Natalie and proudly stated that my daughter, the child who never asked me for a single dime, was the absolute sole beneficiary and the only controlling trustee of the entire foundation. I looked back at Cynthia, who was trembling violently on the floor. I looked at Nolan, who was clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. I told them that they were completely and permanently disinherited. They owned no house, they had no money, and they possessed absolutely zero legal standing to challenge the transfer. I explained that by attempting to forcefully declare me mentally incompetent, they had handed my lawyers the exact legal justification needed to trigger an emergency asset protection clause, shielding my wealth from predatory relatives. They were entirely destitute, left with nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs. Nolan dropped to his knees beside his mother, sobbing uncontrollably. He pleaded with Natalie, begging his newly discovered sister to show him mercy. He rambled frantically about the dangerous men from the illegal syndicate who would come for him by tomorrow morning if he did not pay his debts. He promised to sign away all future rights if she just gave him enough cash to survive the week. Valerie turned on him instantly, screaming that he had ruined her life and that she was filing for divorce the moment they left the building. Cynthia reached a shaking hand toward Natalie, crying false, desperate tears, trying to invoke a maternal bond that had never existed. She begged for a second chance, claiming she was young and terrified when she made the decision to surrender her baby. Natalie did not flinch. She looked down at the weeping, pathetic remnants of my family with cold, calculated precision. She spoke with a sharp, commanding corporate tone that mirrored my own. She told Cynthia that she already had a father who loved her and an uncle who had given his life to protect her. She stated that Cynthia was nothing more than a biological donor who had attempted to murder the only parent Natalie had left. She told Nolan that his debts were his own problem and that the syndicate could have him. She absolutely refused to extend a single shred of mercy to the monsters who had tortured her family. Before Cynthia could attempt another desperate plea, Attorney Bennett leaned forward in his leather chair. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table and pressed a small concealed button on his desk console. A soft chime echoed through the room. The door to the adjoining executive suite, which had remained firmly closed for the entire meeting, suddenly swung wide open. The air in the room grew instantly heavy as 4 individuals stepped through the doorway. 2 men wore dark suits and stern expressions, clearly identifying themselves as federal agents. Behind them walked 2 local police detectives, their utility belts clinking softly in the quiet room. The imposing presence of law enforcement completely extinguished any remaining hope Cynthia and Nolan had of bargaining their way out of the crisis. The lead federal agent stepped forward, a thick file folder clutched in his hand. He did not offer any polite introductions. He looked directly at Cynthia and announced that the state bank manager had officially flagged her actions under severe federal elder financial abuse statutes. The local detective stepped beside him, holding up a copy of the certified toxicology report from the Metropolitan Hospital. He informed Cynthia that the lethal levels of benzodiazepines found in the soil sample, combined with the hidden video footage, provided immediate and irrefutable grounds for her arrest on charges of attempted manslaughter and premeditated assault. The second federal agent turned his attention to Nolan. He read from a prepared warrant stating that the massive unauthorized offshore wire transfers executing from my living room had been tracked and verified. He informed my son that he was being taken into federal custody for multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Valerie began backing away toward the wall, crying hysterically, claiming she had no idea what her husband was doing, but a female detective calmly stepped into her path. The detective advised Valerie that her signature was on several forged credit card applications, making her a direct accessory to the financial crimes. Cynthia tried to stand up, her legs giving out beneath her, as a detective grabbed her arm, twisting it firmly behind her back. She screamed my name, demanding that I stop them, demanding that I remember our 40 years of marriage. I simply stood beside my daughter, watching in absolute silence, as the cold, heavy steel handcuffs were locked around my wife's wrists. The loud, metallic clicking sound was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Nolan did not fight. He went completely limp, sobbing like a broken child, as the federal agents hauled him to his feet and secured his hands. He knew the illegal syndicate would not be his biggest problem anymore. He was going to a federal penitentiary where his arrogant tech startup dreams would be replaced by decades in a concrete cell. The trap had completely closed. The predators who had planned to strip my mind and my wealth were now bound in chains, facing the absolute destruction of their lives. I looked at Natalie, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over my soul. The long war was finally over. The law had stepped in, and my family was exactly where they belonged. The cold, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place was the most absolute, definitive sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It echoed through the sterile air of the corporate conference room, signaling the precise moment my 40-year nightmare came to a permanent end. Cynthia shattered. The elegant, poised country club matriarch vanished completely, evaporating into the ether. In her place was a frantic, shrieking criminal. She thrashed against the grip of the federal agents, twisting her body and kicking her expensive heels against the polished mahogany table. She screamed vile, vicious obscenities at me, her voice cracking into a guttural, animalistic howl. She cursed the day she met me and cursed the daughter she had thrown away. The detectives did not flinch. They hauled her to her feet, with practiced professional force, ignoring her demands to call her country club friends for bail money. They read her the Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice, drowning out her desperate claims that the toxicology report was a fabricated lie. She was dragged out the heavy double doors, her manicured nails clawing uselessly at the doorframe, facing a massive prison sentence for attempted manslaughter and federal fraud. Nolan did not fight. He did not scream. He simply dropped to his knees on the expensive carpet. His custom-tailored suit crumpled around him as all the blood drained from his arrogant face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He stared at the floor, breathing in short, rapid gasps. The reality of his situation had finally penetrated his thick skull. He knew the federal wire fraud charges meant hard time in a federal penitentiary. But more importantly, he realized that the violent sports betting syndicate he owed $400,000 to operated extensively inside the prison system. Without my house to sell, and without my retirement portfolio to liquidate, he had absolutely no way to pay his massive debts. He was a dead man walking. The federal agents hauled him up by his armpits, and he hung completely limp between them, sobbing like a terrified child who finally understood there were monsters hiding in the dark. Valerie was arrested right beside him. She collapsed against the glass wall, weeping uncontrollably. She begged the detectives to let her go, crying that she was only a housewife and knew nothing about the forged loans or the poisoned tea. The female detective simply tightened the cuffs around the wrists of Valerie, calmly reminding her that her signature was physically inked on multiple fraudulent credit card applications. Valerie wailed about her ruined social reputation and her canceled country club memberships, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to trade her designer dresses for an orange prison jumpsuit as an accessory to grand larceny. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Natalie, watching them being marched down the long corporate hallway. The heavy glass elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the final desperate scream of Cynthia. The profound, heavy silence that descended upon Attorney Bennett's office was incredibly beautiful. It was the sound of an iron cage locking the predators inside. The toxic, suffocating noise that had dominated my life for 4 decades was entirely, permanently eradicated. A month passed. The transition was rapid and completely merciless. The legal machine ground my former family into absolute dust. Cynthia was denied bail, her premeditated attempt to poison me, rendering her an extreme flight risk and a profound danger to the public. She sat in a concrete cell awaiting a trial she had absolutely zero chance of winning. Nolan was placed in a high-security protective custody unit, isolated and terrified, jumping at his own shadow as he awaited his federal sentencing. Valerie accepted a plea deal, turning state witness against her own husband and mother-in-law to secure a slightly reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. They turned on each other the very second the money dried up, proving that their entire bond was built purely on parasitic greed. I did not attend their preliminary hearings. I had absolutely no desire to look at them ever again. Instead, I focused on dismantling the physical monument to my past mistakes. I sold the sprawling suburban estate to a commercial developer who planned to bulldoze the massive colonial house and build a series of modern townhomes. I watched the moving trucks haul away the expensive furniture, the Persian rugs, and the delicate porcelain teacups. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound weight lifting from my shoulders. The fortress of expectations and lies was gone forever. The $2.5 million retirement portfolio and all subsequent liquid assets rested safely in the impenetrable blind trust. I handed the absolute control of the financial empire over to Natalie. She managed the funds with the exact same sharp, calculating brilliance she used to run her architectural firm. She possessed an innate understanding of the value of hard work, an understanding forged by the humble, honest upbringing my brother had provided her. She expanded the charitable foundation we established, directing significant capital toward legal defense funds for vulnerable seniors facing domestic abuse. She took the corrupted wealth Cynthia and Nolan had tried to steal and transformed it into a powerful shield for those who could not defend themselves. I left the affluent suburbs permanently. I purchased a modest, comfortable wooden house in the quiet coastal town just 3 blocks away from the architectural firm of Natalie. I traded the roar of imported sports cars and the fake smiles of country club elites for the soothing, rhythmic sound of the ocean waves and the honest, hard-working people of the coast. I woke up every morning breathing in the crisp, salty air, feeling a deep, restorative peace settling into my weary bones. My health returned in full force. The lingering physical effects of the heavy sedatives Cynthia had fed me completely vanished. I was strong, lucid, and entirely free. It was a cool, crisp Tuesday morning when I made the short drive to the local coastal cemetery. The sky was a brilliant, unobstructed blue, and a gentle sea breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the gravel pathways. I walked quietly across the damp green grass, stopping in front of a modest, polished granite headstone. I took off my canvas hat, holding it respectfully against my chest. I stared at the engraved name of my older brother, Russell. I stood there in the absolute tranquility, reflecting on the profound, sheer magnitude of what this quiet mechanic had accomplished. He had lived his entire life in a cramped, drafty apartment, wearing faded flannel shirts, and waking up before dawn to turn a wrench. He had denied himself the comforts of a wife and a family of his own. He had borne the terrible, crushing weight of the monstrous secret of my wife in total silence. He never asked for recognition. He never demanded a medal. He simply did the right thing when the rest of the world looked away. I heard the soft crunching of footsteps on the gravel behind me. I turned my head and watched Natalie approach. She was wearing a thick, woven sweater against the morning chill, carrying a large, beautiful bouquet of fresh, bright yellow wildflowers. She smiled at me, her green eyes shining with a deep, restorative warmth that melted the last frozen corners of my heart. She walked up beside me, standing shoulder to shoulder in the quiet cemetery. She knelt down and gently placed the vibrant flowers at the base of the headstone, carefully arranging the stems so they faced the morning sun. She stood back up and took a long, steady breath. She looked at the grave and whispered a soft thank you to the man who had rescued her from the cold machinery of the state foster system. She thanked him for driving those 140 miles every second Thursday. She thanked him for the college tuition, the new brake pads on her first car, and the absolute unconditional love he had poured into her life. Then Natalie turned to face me. The ocean breeze caught a loose strand of her hair, blowing it across her cheek. She reached out and wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a tight, fiercely loving embrace. I buried my face in her shoulder, closing my eyes as a profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude washed over me. She pulled back slightly, keeping her hands resting warmly on my shoulders. She looked directly into my eyes and smiled that crooked, familiar smile. She told me it was time to go home. And then for the very first time in 35 years, she called me Dad. The word hit me like a jolt of pure electricity. It was the single most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It repaired every broken piece of my soul. I smiled back at my daughter, tears of absolute pure joy blurring my vision. I offered her my arm, and we turned away from the grave, walking together back toward the quiet coastal town. As we walked, I realized the ultimate poetic justice of the sacrifice of my brother. Russell did not just save an innocent, discarded infant 35 years ago. He had planted a seed of absolute salvation. His tireless, silent devotion had raised the fierce, brilliant warrior who stood beside me in that corporate conference room. He had forged the exact weapon I needed to defeat the monsters living in my house. His final hidden secret had directly saved my life today. The toxic cycle of greed, manipulation, and betrayal was permanently broken. The shadows were gone. I was a 66-year-old man walking in the sunlight, and my life was finally just beginning. The most profound lesson I learned from this entire nightmare is that true family is never defined by a shared last name, a marriage certificate, or the expensive roof over your head. True family is defined by the silent, selfless sacrifices people make to protect you when you are most vulnerable. Blood might tie you to ruthless predators who view your life merely as a financial resource. But genuine loyalty, mutual respect, and unconditional love are the actual foundations of kinship. My brother lived in crushing poverty just to shield my daughter from a toxic environment, proving that the quietest acts of devotion hold far more power than the loudest, most expensive declarations of fake love. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share in the comments below if you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to finally discover your true family.